It was 4:43 a.m. when my phone started ringing. Not vibrating, not lighting up silently. Ringing, loud enough to pull me out of a dream so abruptly that for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. The room was dark. The only light came from the digital clock beside my bed. 4:43 a.m. Nobody called me at that hour. Nobody. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 31 years old. I work as a project coordinator for a construction company in Chicago, and for most of my life I've been the kind of person who trusts routines. I wake up at the same time, drive the same route, pay my bills early, avoid unnecessary drama. Predictability has always felt safer than surprises. So when I saw unknown number flashing on my screen, my first instinct was to ignore it. But something stopped me. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, maybe the fact that my mother used to say that the most important phone call of your life never arrives when you're ready for it. I answered, "Hello?" For a second there was only silence, then a woman's voice. Old, calm, controlled. "Emily?" "Yes." The woman inhaled slowly. "Listen carefully." The strange thing wasn't what she said. The strange thing was how certain she sounded. Like she already knew I would answer. Like she had rehearsed this conversation. "You must not go to work today." I sat up immediately. "What? Stay home." My confusion quickly turned into irritation. "Who is this?" "You don't know me." "Then why are you calling me?" Another pause. Then, "Because if you leave your apartment before noon, you'll disappear." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was ridiculous. The woman didn't laugh. She remained silent, waiting. "You have the wrong number." "No." Her voice sharpened slightly. "I have exactly the right number." Then the call ended. Just like that. No explanation. No goodbye. Nothing. I stared at the phone. Then, checked the call log. Unknown number. No information. No trace. For several seconds I simply sat there, trying to decide whether I had just spoken to a prank caller, a mentally unstable stranger, or someone who genuinely believed what she was saying. Eventually I shook my head. People are weird. That was the simplest explanation, and simple explanations are usually the correct ones. I got out of bed, took a shower, made coffee, got dressed. By 7:15 a.m., I was ready for work. The strange phone call had already started fading from my thoughts, until I opened my apartment door and froze. A small envelope sat on the floor outside. White, unmarked. No postage, no address, no name, nothing. My stomach tightened slightly. I looked down the hallway. Empty. I bent down and picked it up. Inside was a single piece of paper. 4 words. "Do not leave today." I stared at it. My pulse immediately sped up, because now it wasn't just a random phone call. Someone had been here. Someone knew where I lived. Someone wanted me to stay home. And suddenly the entire situation felt less ridiculous. I checked every apartment door. No other envelopes. Just mine. I walked back inside, locked the door, read the note again, then a 4th time. I wish I could say I immediately recognized the danger. I didn't. I recognized discomfort. That's all. And discomfort is easy to ignore. By 7:45 a.m., I convinced myself someone was playing a stupid joke. By 8 a.m., I grabbed my keys. At 8:03 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text message. Unknown sender. 3 words. "Look outside now." A chill moved through me. I approached the window, pulled the curtain aside, and my heart stopped. My car was gone. Not stolen. Destroyed. A delivery truck had crashed directly into the parking area less than 5 minutes earlier. Emergency vehicles surrounded the scene. Glass covered the pavement, and the exact spot where my car should have been looked like a war zone. I stood there speechless, because if I had followed my normal schedule, if I had left exactly when I always left, I would have been standing beside that car, maybe inside it, maybe dead. My phone buzzed again. Unknown sender. Still no name. This time the message said, "Now, do you believe me?" For the first time that morning, fear replaced confusion. A real fear, the kind that settles deep inside your chest. Because coincidences happen, but not like this. Not twice. Not in a single morning. I stared at the damaged parking lot below, then typed a reply. "Who are you?" The response arrived instantly. "Someone trying to keep you alive." I sat down slowly. Every logical explanation I had built throughout the morning was beginning to crack. Someone knew, not guessed. Knew, and that raised a much more frightening question. How? Hours passed. I stayed inside, watching, waiting, thinking. Around 11:30 a.m., another message arrived. "You need to check your mother's safety deposit box." My entire body went cold, because there was only one problem. My mother had died 6 months earlier. Officially, she suffered a heart attack. Unexpected, sudden, tragic, but ordinary. At least that's what everyone said. The police, doctors, friends, family, everyone. Yet during the final week of her life, she had become strangely anxious. She kept asking unusual questions. Had anyone contacted me? Was anyone following me? Had I noticed unfamiliar vehicles? At the time, I assumed grief was affecting her judgment. My father had died years earlier. Maybe loneliness was catching up with her. Now I wasn't so sure. Another message appeared. Your mother knew this day was coming. My hands started shaking. Who are you? The answer arrived after several seconds. Check the box. Then decide whether to trust me. I stared at the screen, and for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I knew I was going to do exactly that. Because whatever was happening, it had started long before the phone call. Long before today. Maybe even long before my mother's death. And somewhere inside me, a terrible realization was beginning to form. Someone had been preparing me for something. I just hadn't known it yet. At 1:15 p.m., I left my apartment for the first time. Not for work, not for lunch, not for errands, for answers. And I had no idea that by sunset, I would discover that my entire life had been built on a secret someone was willing to kill for. The closer I got to the bank, the harder it became to convince myself that I was still dealing with something ordinary. Because although every rational part of my mind continued searching for explanations that would fit inside the world I understood, every new detail seemed determined to push me further away from normality and deeper into a reality where coincidence had stopped being believable and patterns had started appearing everywhere I looked, whether I wanted to see them or not. The safety deposit box was located inside a small private bank downtown, the kind of place that catered to wealthy families and long-term clients who valued discretion above convenience. And as I stepped through the glass entrance doors, I immediately noticed something that made my stomach tighten, because the receptionist looked at me with a strange expression the moment I gave her my name. Not surprise exactly, but recognition, as though she had been expecting me long before I arrived. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She didn't verify details twice. She simply nodded once and said, "Please follow me." Those 4 words echoed strangely in my head as I walked behind her through a secured hallway lined with cameras and reinforced doors. Because there was a certainty in her tone that felt rehearsed, and for the first time that day I wondered whether my mother had arranged something long before her death. Something she had never told me about, because she knew that explaining it would raise questions she couldn't safely answer. The deposit box itself was smaller than I expected. A simple metal container, nothing remarkable, nothing dramatic. Yet the moment it was placed in front of me, my pulse accelerated, because whatever was inside had remained hidden for 6 months after my mother's death. 6 months. And now, suddenly, someone wanted me to find it. I opened the box. At first glance, there appeared to be very little inside. A sealed envelope, a silver key, and a photograph. I picked up the photograph first. The image showed my mother standing beside a man I had never seen before. They appeared younger, at least 15 years younger, both smiling, both standing in front of a lake. And written on the back, in my mother's handwriting, were 5 words. "If you find this, run." My chest tightened immediately. Not because of the message itself, because of the handwriting. It was unquestionably hers, the same handwriting I had seen on birthday cards, holiday notes, and grocery lists throughout my entire life. There was no possibility of mistake, no possibility of forgery. The message was real, and somehow that made it more frightening. I opened the envelope next. Inside was a handwritten letter, several pages long. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I began reading. "Emily, if you are reading this letter, then 2 things have already happened. First, I am gone. Second, someone has finally found you." I stopped reading. My eyes moved back to the first sentence, then forward again. "Someone has finally found you." Not contacted, not approached, found. The word carried a meaning I couldn't ignore. I continued. "For most of your life I have lied to you, not because I wanted to, but because the truth would have placed you in danger long before you were ready to understand it. Everything you know about your childhood is incomplete. Everything you believe about your father is incomplete. And everything you believe about yourself is incomplete." I felt my throat tighten. The room suddenly seemed smaller, the air heavier. My mother continued. "When you were 7 years old, something happened that should have killed you. Officially, the records say you nearly drowned during a family trip. That story was created afterward. The truth is that someone tried to take you, and they failed." I stopped breathing for a moment, because I remembered that trip, or at least fragments of it. Cold water. Panic. My mother crying. doctors asking questions. But memory is strange, especially childhood memory, and suddenly I wasn't certain how much of it belonged to me, and how much had been shaped by the stories repeated afterward. The letter continued. For years I believed they had given up. I was wrong. Your father believed they would return one day. He spent the rest of his life preparing for that possibility. If they are moving openly now, then it means something has changed. Something they can no longer control. And it almost certainly involves you. I stared at the page. My father had died when I was 14. A car accident. At least that was the official explanation. But suddenly I found myself wondering how many official explanations in my life had actually been true. Then I reached the final page, and what I read there made my blood run cold. Trust no one who arrives with credentials. Trust no one who claims to be protecting you. The only person who knows the full truth is the man in the photograph. His name is Nathan Hale. Find him before they find you. I lowered the letter slowly. My hands were shaking. The silver key remained on the table beside me, and attached to it was a small tag. Warehouse 18. Locker 407. Before I could process what any of it meant, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. Again. I answered immediately. Who are you? The voice that replied was not the woman from before. It was a man, and he sounded terrified. Get out of the bank right now. My heart skipped. What? Listen carefully, he said, speaking rapidly as if every second mattered. 2 people entered the building 30 seconds ago, and they are asking specifically for you. I stood up instantly. Who are they? The silence that followed lasted only a moment. Then he answered. They're carrying federal credentials. A cold wave moved through me. Because of my mother's warning, trust no one who arrives with credentials. My eyes dived toward the door, toward the hallway, toward the security cameras. Everything suddenly felt different. Every person became a possible threat. Every movement became suspicious. Who are you? I asked. But the line disconnected. Just ended. No explanation. No goodbye. Nothing. I grabbed the photograph, the letter, the key, and moved toward the exit. Fast. Not running. Not yet. Just moving. Trying to appear normal. Trying not to attract attention. The hallway seemed longer than before. The silence louder. And then I saw them. 2 men. Dark suits. Professional posture. Walking directly toward me. Not searching. Not looking around. Coming directly toward me. As if they already knew exactly where I would be. One of them reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, for identification. But strangely, that frightened me more. Because if my mother's letter was true, then the people carrying credentials were exactly the people I should fear. Miss Carter? The taller man asked. I didn't answer. His expression remained calm, controlled, practiced. We need a moment of your time. Something deep inside me reacted instantly. Instinct. The same instinct that had answered the phone. The same instinct that had kept me home that morning. And for the first time all day, I stopped questioning it. I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard immediate movement. Fast movement. Not surprised movement. Prepared movement. As though they had expected resistance from the very beginning. I burst through the side exit of the building and into the afternoon sunlight, my heart hammering so violently that it felt impossible anyone nearby couldn't hear it. And as I pushed through the crowd moving along the sidewalk, I realized with terrifying clarity that my life had crossed an invisible line somewhere during the last few hours, because this was no longer about strange phone calls or mysterious letters or unanswered questions from the past. This was about pursuit, and the people chasing me were operating with the confidence of individuals who believed they had every right to do so. And that was when I noticed the black SUV waiting across the street. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. Gray hair, sharp eyes, calm expression. The same voice I had heard at 4:43 that morning. The woman who called me. The woman who somehow knew my car would be destroyed. The woman who somehow knew about my mother's box. She looked directly at me, then said only 3 words. Get in, Emily. And somehow, despite every warning I had ever been taught about trusting strangers, I did. The moment the SUV door closed behind me and the outside noise disappeared beneath the muffled isolation of reinforced glass, I realized that I had crossed another line, one that felt even more dangerous than running from the men inside the bank, because at least with them I understood the threat was obvious, while with the woman sitting beside me, I had absolutely no idea whether I had just escaped from danger or willingly entered something far worse. The vehicle pulled away from the curb almost immediately, merging into traffic with such smooth precision that it became obvious this wasn't an impulsive rescue but something planned long before I ever stepped out of the bank. And as I glanced toward the rear window, I noticed that the two men who had been following me emerged from the building only seconds later, scanning the street with controlled urgency before one of them raised a hand to his ear and began speaking into what appeared to be a concealed communication device. The woman noticed me watching. "They're already tracking us," she said calmly. I turned toward her. "Who are you?" For several seconds, she remained silent. Not because she was avoiding the question, because she was deciding how much truth I could handle. Finally, she spoke. "My name is Margaret Ross." I waited. Nothing. No explanation. Just a name. "That doesn't tell me anything." "No," she replied quietly. "It doesn't." The city moved past us outside in blurred reflections of glass and steel, while my pulse continued pounding against my ribs. And for the first time since that morning, I began to feel the full weight of exhaustion settling into my body, because less than 10 hours earlier, I had been asleep in my apartment believing my life was ordinary, and now I was sitting inside an unfamiliar vehicle with a stranger, while unknown people pursued me through a city that suddenly felt hostile in ways I could no longer explain. The woman folded her hands. Then, she looked directly at me. "I worked with your father." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were impossible, because they were specific, and after an entire day filled with uncertainty, specifics felt dangerous. "My father died 17 years ago." "I know." "Then how did you know him?" A faint sadness crossed her face, the kind of sadness that comes from remembering something painful rather than experiencing it again. "Because he saved my life." The answer hung in the air between us. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then she continued. "Emily, everything you have been told about your father's death was a lie." The statement should have shocked me. Instead, it felt strangely inevitable, as though every revelation that day had been preparing me for this one. What really happened? Margaret looked out the window, then back at me. "He was murdered." The world seemed to narrow, not physically, emotionally, because no matter how strange the day had become, some part of me had still been holding on to the belief that my parents' deaths were separate from everything else. Normal tragedies, unrelated losses. Now even that was gone. "He discovered something," Margaret said. "Something powerful people spent decades hiding." "What?" Instead of answering, she reached into a leather folder beside her and handed me a photograph. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. A group of people standing outside a research facility, smiling, posing, nothing unusual. Then I noticed my father, younger, standing near the center, and beside him was the same man from the photograph inside the safety deposit box. Nathan Hale, the name for my mother's letter. My eyes moved lower, toward a date printed in the corner, and suddenly my stomach dropped, because the photograph was taken 3 years before I was born. I looked back at Margaret. What am I looking at? The beginning. Those two words sent a chill through me. Because beginnings matter. Beginnings explain everything that follows. Margaret took a slow breath. Then she finally started talking. Not in fragments, not in hints, but in a story. And the more she spoke, the more impossible my life became. 32 years earlier, a private research initiative had been created under the protection of several powerful organizations, operating through layers of secrecy and legal insulation so complex that almost nobody involved understood the full scope of what was happening. And according to Margaret, the project officially focused on predictive behavioral analysis, which sounded harmless enough until you understood what they were actually attempting to do. They wanted to predict people, not trends, not markets, people, individual human lives, choices, decisions, actions, entire futures. And for years they collected data on thousands of subjects, building systems designed to identify patterns so detailed that human behavior could be anticipated long before choices were consciously made. Most of the research failed, but not all of it. And somewhere along the way, according to Margaret, they discovered something unexpected. Someone. Me. I stared at her. "What are you talking about?" She held my gaze. "Your birth wasn't an accident." My entire body went cold. The words felt wrong, unnatural. Like hearing someone casually explain that gravity was optional. "What does that mean?" "It means you were selected." Selected. The word echoed inside my head. I hated it immediately, because people select objects, projects, experiments, not children. Margaret continued. "There were dozens before you." A silence followed. A terrible silence. Then, most didn't survive. For several seconds I couldn't breathe. I simply stared at her, waiting for her to say she was joking. Waiting for reality to return. It didn't. My father knew? Eventually, my mother? She knew enough. I looked away. My thoughts were colliding faster than I could organize them. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Nothing felt stable anymore. Then Margaret said something that changed everything. The people looking for you today aren't trying to silence you. I looked back at her. Then what do they want? Her expression hardened. They want to finish what they started. The SUV left the city an hour later, moving toward the northern edge of the state where roads became quieter and buildings gradually disappeared. And throughout the drive, Margaret continued filling the gaps in a story that seemed too enormous to belong to a single life, explaining how my father had eventually discovered evidence suggesting that children connected to the project were being monitored for years after birth, how he had attempted to expose what he found, and how every person who helped him either disappeared, died unexpectedly, or abandoned the investigation under circumstances that never fully made sense. By sunset, we arrived at an abandoned industrial district. Rusting warehouses, broken fences, silence. Margaret parked near a massive building, whose faded exterior number immediately caught my attention. Warehouse 18. The key from my mother's box. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Margaret looked at me. "Whatever is inside," she said quietly. "Your parents protected it for decades." My heart pounded. We stepped out. The air felt colder here, heavier, almost expectant. The warehouse doors opened with a metallic groan that echoed through the empty structure. And as we moved deeper inside, I noticed rows of forgotten equipment covered in dust, shadows stretching across concrete floors, and signs that nobody had worked there in years. At the far end stood a series of storage lockers, numbered, locked, waiting. Locker 407. My hands trembled as I inserted the silver key. The lock clicked. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Slowly, I opened the door. Inside sat a single black case. Nothing else. No documents. No explanation. Just the case. I lifted it carefully, placed it on the floor, and opened it. The moment the lid rose, both Margaret and I froze, because inside wasn't money, or records, or evidence. It was a video recorder, old, compact, and attached to it was a note written in my father's handwriting, "For Emily, only if everything fails." My vision blurred instantly, because after 17 years, after believing I would never hear his voice again, I suddenly realized that somewhere inside that recorder, my father had left a message he never expected me to receive unless the world around us had already fallen apart. Margaret slowly exhaled. I looked at the recorder, then at the warehouse around us, and for the first time that day, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt certainty, because whatever answers I had been chasing since dawn, whatever secret had destroyed my family, whatever truth powerful people had spent decades hiding, it was waiting for me inside that recording. And somewhere outside the warehouse, beyond the growing darkness of the evening, engines were beginning to approach. They had found us. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the warehouse suddenly became, because although moments earlier my attention had been consumed by the approaching vehicles somewhere beyond the darkness outside, the sight of my father's handwriting on that small note seemed to pull every other sound out of the world, leaving only the pounding of my heartbeat and the overwhelming realization that after 17 years I was about to hear the voice of a man I had spent most of my life missing. My hands were trembling as I picked up the recorder. Margaret didn't speak. She simply stepped back and allowed me the space to face whatever my father had left behind. For several seconds I couldn't move. I just stared at the device, because part of me was terrified, not of what I might discover, of what I might lose. There is a strange comfort in unanswered questions, because as long as a mystery remains unsolved, there is always room for hope, always room for a different explanation, always room to imagine that perhaps the people we lost were exactly who we believed them to be. Answers take that away. Answers replace possibility with certainty, and certainty can hurt. Finally, I pressed play. The screen flickered. Static appeared. Then a face emerged. My father's face. Older than I remembered. Tired. Worried. But undeniably him. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Because memories are fragile things. Voices fade. Expressions disappear. Years pass. And suddenly there he was again, looking directly into the camera, looking directly at me. "Emily," he began. The sound of his voice hit me like a physical force. My knees nearly gave out. "You are probably watching this because I failed." His expression remained calm, but I could see exhaustion behind his eyes. The exhaustion of a man who had been carrying something alone for far too long. "If you're seeing this recording, then your mother is gone, I am gone, and the people we spent years hiding from have finally reached you." I swallowed hard. Beside me, Margaret remained silent. My father's image continued.